All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Lux webinar on the UN update, moving toward a global treaty on plastics. My name is Mike Coleman, Senior Vice President here at Lux, working with Anthony Schiavo, who's going to be leading the discussion today. And this is, if you're a podcast fan, you might have heard people talk about an emergency podcast they do when some big news item happens that they have they want to react to. This is I don't know if we would call it an emergency webinar, but it was because it was planned in advance. But we are here reacting to the latest meeting around the UN's prospective global treaty on plastics, which just wrapped up on Monday, April 29th. So we're going to review some of what's been happening from that meeting, some of the conclusions and coming out of it, and look forward to the next steps for the rest of this process towards that prospective UN global treaty on plastics. So during the webinar, you can type in any questions you have to the questions box on your screen. We'll answer as many of those as we can get to. But if we don't get to yours, or you think up another good one afterwards, you can email questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we'll respond to those as well. So with that, I will hand things off to Anthony to begin the discussion.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks everyone for joining me today. And like Mike said, it's our opportunity to react to the fourth Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, or INC4. This is our third webinar of this variety on the UN Plastics Treaty, and I'm very happy to have Mike here joining me on camera to talk about it. I do want to set up, though, for those of you who have not been able to join us. I'm sure some of you, this is your first time hearing about this treaty or first time joining one of these webinars that we're doing. I want to just lay a little bit of a groundwork. So what we're looking at right here is the moment the UN signed UNEA Resolution 514. This is the resolution that authorized the group to create this Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to create a binding instrument on plastic pollution, also in the marine environment, right? This is the authorization, essentially, that the UN gave itself to do this work and to create this legally binding instrument. This is 2 years ago. This is March 2022. This is important for a number of different reasons. One, it's important because some of the particular provisions in this treaty are very, very impactful or potentially impactful. What you're looking at here is a screenshot from the original Zero draft. And right up front, one of the first options, policy options in that draft, was a restriction on the production and supply of primary plastics, right? Basically a cap on global plastics production. This is a really big deal, right? This is a really substantive piece of global regulation if it were to be passed. We'll get into the details of what's likely to be included in the treaty versus not, but the potential for really disruptive impact has been here. And it was around the time that the Zero draft was published that people really started to sit up and take notice of this effort, although we've been tracking it since the beginning. But on a bit higher level, this treaty is going to shape global regulation for basically the rest of our lives, right? It's pretty substantive. It will really determine what types of policy elements are commonly adopted globally. It will determine a lot about how the global level of cooperation, global markets, how those will emerge, right? So even taking out some of the most impactful single provisions or policy levers, you're still going to have a huge, sea change, a huge shaping of the plastic market as a function of this treaty. That's why it's so important. So I mentioned, March 2022, we had that resolution 514 signed. We had the first negotiating committee meeting in December. In the second meeting in June 23, we had the zero draft. The zero draft is basically the starting point. The idea is that it would contain all of the potential options for the future binding instrument. Then in November 2023, we had the third INC and we got comments on the zero draft. I would say that the third INC in particular was pretty widely regarded as a disappointment, both from the perspective of the most high ambition groups, because this is I think that one of the big stories of the third INC was really that we saw the consolidation and the formalization of opposition to a more ambitious treaty, right? So there's a lot more structured opposition to these goals, but also it was just disappointing from a process and procedural level. I think by INC3, it became clear that things were moving a lot more slowly than the UN wanted. We had just barely finalized a lot of the procedural stuff, right? Very important rules for how this committee would go, and we're almost halfway through, or even more than halfway through, right? The whole process, and we're just barely finalizing some of that stuff. In addition,
we also found there, right, that the procedural rules were ones that were going to be I don't want to say slanted, but the procedural rules would be set up were such that it would be easier for the countries that were resisting higher ambition or more dramatic treaty to prevent that from happening.
That's correct. Very briefly, basically you can either have a 2/3 vote on provisions, or you can have a consensus-based system where basically almost everyone has to agree. Consensus is a much higher threshold. It is going to produce a less ambitious document, almost certainly, and that's the basic format of the decision-making that we're going with going forward, right? And one of the other important elements from INC3 is that we didn't get a lot of intersessional work, right? A lot is happening between, and maybe even, the most of the sausage gets made in between these meetings, right? But the work that gets done in between the meetings has to be authorized in the meeting. And at INC3, they really failed to ratify a sufficient program of intersessional work. And so now we're here in April. We had the INC4 in Ottawa, and in November 24, we have INC5 in Busan, and that's technically our deadline. In Resolution 514, it says, hey, we want to get this thing done by the end of 2024. So, the organizers, like Ingar Anderson, the executive director of the UN Environmental Program, they're continuing to put a positive spin, a positive message out. We will continue to need plastic for use cases, but there's growing agreement that short-lived and single-use plastics can go, right? Is this legit? Is there growing consensus? Is there growing agreement? In some ways, we'll be talking about it. But I think the big question is, can we really meet the 2024 deadline for a binding instrument? And what will this binding instrument look like? Now, unfortunately, I have to level with you all here, the audience. It's going to be difficult for us to do a really detailed analysis of the text of the current draft. And I'll tell you why. As a result of this process, basically between INC3 and INC4, we got a ton of comments from the countries on the zero draft. And between INC3 and 4, all of those comments were integrated, cleaned up, formatted, and now included in this draft binding instrument. What you're looking at here are the options for the principles. This is a non-material sort of preamble section of the draft. What you can see is that there are more than, I think there's like 30 or so options for the principles. Everything from, the polluter pays principle, a just transition, to gender perspective, to local and indigenous knowledge, right? So the number of options, the body of text itself has really exploded, right? We've kind of gone the opposite direction. And we have this huge number of options and huge number of different perspectives to sort through. In INC4, we did, the delegates did really start to get down to the text, right? There was actual negotiation over the text, and that process of refining the text really began to move forward in INC4. But we are still really far from anything close to a refined document or a agreed upon document. And in fact, we're still pretty, in some ways, we're further from that than we were at the start, right? So unfortunately, there's not a ton for us to really say about the text of the document as such. There's a couple comments we're going to make, here and on the next slide in particular, but right now we're going to have to really wait and see. And one of the big questions is how much we can get done on this in the intersessional work, right? That is going to really decide what's possible at Busan and indeed if the deadline is possible to meet in Busan. One important point of contention, we touched on this last time in our previous webinar. One of the big sticking points, one of the big areas where there's a lot of disagreement is on the scope of the draft, and in particular, this idea of regulating primary plastic production, capping primary plastic production. The contention, broadly speaking, of the low ambition countries, the oil and plastics producing countries like Saudi Arabia, China, Iran, Russia, is that the scope of the resolution does not include plastic production, right? That the scope should be strictly or pretty narrowly focused on end-of-life waste management, maybe inclusive of design of products or problematic form factors, but maybe not, right? They want a very narrowly scoped document. And in the most recent draft, binding instrument draft, there is a lot of discussion and there is a lot of calling back to the original resolution 514, right? Both the groups who want a very expansive document, one that includes caps on plastic production or regulation of primary plastic production, and the groups who want a more narrowly scoped document are calling back to resolution 514, right? Now, a basic reading of 514, I think pretty clearly includes primary plastic production. You can see here, it's the second block of text, and it says, this could include binding and voluntary approaches based on a comprehensive approach that addresses the full life cycle of plastic. The full life cycle of plastic to me pretty clearly means production included, right? What else could it mean, right? Certainly, if you were doing a life cycle analysis and you did not include the production of plastic, you would be looked at significantly askance. But I want to back off from the text a little bit here. The debate about the scope is not a debate about the meaning of resolution 514, right? Like the people who oppose a broader scope are not, they don't have very firm principles about, the interpretation of UN documents. They are plastics producers and oil and gas producers, and they do not want production caps on plastics because it would be bad for them, right? That's what this is about. And so, there is this kind of textual debate happening, but I encourage you not to get caught up too much in the text and to lose sight of the sort of political forces at work here.
Yeah, but I thought this was interesting that when we had the discussion back in November around INC 3, I had kind of taken away from that based on the procedural changes that you referenced, the consensus-based decision-making, that this idea of actual restrictions on primary plastic production coming out of this was probably dead in the water. But you're saying at least it's not quite dead yet.
It's not quite dead yet. Maybe you've seen The Princess Bride, right? And it's only
that was the reference, yes.
half dead, right? So mostly dead. I think I still think it's very unlikely that we get any of these primary restrictions on plastics, but certainly they're still in the document, right? And it's still possible that they could be included in the final binding instrument, even if I think that's really, really unlikely. Something big could change between now and Busan, right? There could be a big political shift, a major spill of plastics, right? A major issue. You can imagine things changing, right? It's not impossible, but I think given the current situation, the it's unlikely we're going to get these plastic restrictions, right? I think the scope will be limited somewhat. Um, but what I would say is that the proponents of those plastic restrictions are fighting to keep them alive, and they're maybe doing so more effectively than I thought they were able to. And also, the process is just moving slowly. So, any death that these restrictions are going to die is going to be a slow, agonizing, dragged out kind of death, right? But this is one of the key things to watch for as we move towards Busan. The other key thing, or one of the other key things that I would highlight, is that corporate lobbying has really ramped up. There's a much larger corporate presence at INC4 in particular, significantly increased from INC3. And I would say the visibility of the corporate presence is a lot larger.
And this is your fault, right? You've been banging the drum for a while that companies need to be paying more attention to what's happening at this, and now they are.
Yeah, this is my fault. I do accept responsibility for this. Since 22, we have been kind of banging the drum, and especially in the last year, we've been really banging the drum on this with a lot of our clients. I'm of two minds about it. And you can see the top here is a headline that's not from the Business Coalition. I should make that clear. It's a headline from a NGO, an environmental group. Fossil fuel lobbyists outnumber national delegations, scientists, and indigenous peoples at plastic treaty negotiations. And on one hand, we are talking about regulating the fossil fuel industry indirectly and the plastics industry very directly, right? So it's natural that they would be at this type of event and that they would want to have a hand shaping these regulations. And also, you can make an argument, I think, purely from the element of, hey, they have the expertise. They have an understanding of what's realistic and what's possible and what's effective, right? What works and what doesn't. And they should be the folks, in the room on some level. However, I will also, and I think my general sympathies lie with the fact that a lot of the groups represented at the UN are, broadly speaking, underrepresented elsewhere, right? And that's a big part of what the function of the UN should be. If you look at, for example, the High Ambition Coalition and Plastics Waste, has 65 or maybe 70 members, and almost all the island nations are members of the High Ambition Coalition, right? Because these are small countries, they have limited resources financially, they have relatively small populations, they just don't have a ton of political power. And the role of the UN is to give those types of groups some amount of political power on par with the larger nations, right? And so those are the types of groups, and indigenous peoples is definitely part of that, that are supposed to be represented and maybe even overrepresented in this process, because these corporate lobbying interests have plenty of other levers to pull in terms of influencing the long-term outcomes here. So I do think this is a very legitimate criticism, and maybe I should have been more clear in my calls to action here. But the business coalition and the business lobbying is really, really interesting because, first of all, what we're looking at here on the bottom part of this section is the Business Coalition for Global Plastics Treaty. This is a group that is primarily users of single-use plastic, right? We're talking about a lot of consumer-facing brands, the Coca-Colas of the world, right? And a few plastic companies. I think Borealis is a member of this group. And you can see is that they are actually supporting a fairly ambitious set of treaty elements here, right? A core obligation to implement restrictions and phase outs in a globally coordinated manner on high-risk products, right? And that includes certain types of plastics, but also certain types of plastic products, right? So this is a pretty meaningful restriction on single-use plastics. Core obligation to do mandatory design requirements. That's a pretty big commitment for companies who stake a lot of their identity and brand and value on, the packaging, right? And a core obligation for global extended producer responsibility. One of the things we called out last time was that EPR was really emerging as an area of consensus. We see that here. It's an area of consensus among the non-state actors as well. But the point I would make is two things. One, of course, these groups don't support the restrictions on total limits on plastic production. They're very happy to shift around or eliminate certain types of plastics so long as they can continue to grow their consumption of plastics total. But the other thing I would highlight is, and this is really interesting, is the corporate lobbyists are generally very concerned or very, I would say, supportive of global binding and consistent regulations. You see that in the language here. Whereas the national actors are much more concerned with national sovereignty, right? So a country like the United States, which has been kind of in the middle, not part of the high ambition coalition, but not part of the low ambition coalition, they support a lot of the same stuff that's here in this text, but the United States is pushing very much for nationally defined plans, nationally defined everything, right? And that nationally defined plan and nature is basically going to make it so that you have a very fragmented world, a very fragmented set of policies. What the business groups are really pushing for is globally consistent policies. So this axis of globally fragmented versus globally consistent is one of the big axes that the policy is going to sort of, the shape of the policy will take. And I think what's important to recognize here is that there's now a much stronger push from these business groups for a more globally consistent set of policies. So we may see more momentum around that as we move towards Busan. I'd also highlight that the environmental groups are continuing to push, and the pressure from NGOs and environmental groups is really continuing to ramp up. The statement here from Graham Forbes, the head of the Greenpeace delegation: if countries don't act between now and INC5 in Busan, the treaty they are likely to get is one that could have been written by ExxonMobil and their acolytes. I don't particularly, buy into this. I mean, I don't know if ExxonMobil would have written the treaty in the first place. And I think
probably not.
A bit more broadly, I think that the corporations are actually supporting of most, if not, almost all but the most sort of extreme, impacts and all but the most sort of, those restrictions on primary plastics, right? But I think what this reflects is that as we go between now and Busan, we're going to have a lot more public pressure and a lot more public I would say, scrutiny of the process, right? And, in the same way that we had a Paris Accords, COP26, sort of, for reasons that were really external to the UN process, that became a huge focal point, right? You had a really big amount of media presence. You had this really big story in the news. All of a sudden, it became this big story. And I think that certainly impacted the policy going forward, right? Those two things, the policy impacts the news story, but the news story impacts the policy. And so one of the things I think that can push us in a more proactive direction is if we get a similar moment of really intense media and public scrutiny going into Busan, and this becomes a much more major news story. That's something that can really shape and push us towards a much more restrictive treaty, a much more ambitious treaty, I should say. So will we get our Paris moment in Busan, right? That's the big question that we need to look out for. I think it's possible. I mean, to me, it's really a coin toss. Like, the consumer awareness of plastics as an issue is certainly there. It's just a question of if it comes through in the media. And then the last thing I would highlight is that the intersessional work, it has not been fully supported throughout the process, particularly INC3. We had a lack of intersessional work. But here we actually have some good intersectional work. This image, the delegates were up until extremely late in the night, wee hours of the morning, trying to get things done. And, we were able to agree, they were able to agree on some relatively ambitious intersectional work, including a lot of work on definitions. And that's going to be very important if we can get some nice agreed upon definitions going into Busan, it's going to make the discussion a lot more productive, and it's going to make it a lot more possible to actually get a signed treaty. So overall, I think the tone and I think the vibe is better coming out of INC4 than INC3, right? INC3 was really a low point in everyone's level of satisfaction with the process. I think more things got done this time, and I think more things are possible going forward. But we're still real close to the deadline. Like, a 2-year deadline for the UN is extraordinarily ambitious anyway. So take it with a grain of salt. But I don't think we're really on track to have a fully done instrument by the time we get to Busan, at the end of Busan. The plastic production, the most impactful potential implementation or element is still in the mix. But as we talked about, it may just be a zombie, right? It's really hard to say on where we stand. Hopefully, with good intersectional work, we'll get a lot more clarity about this by the time we get to Busan. And, that's really going to be key to meeting those deadlines, right? We have to streamline this draft into a final document. Definitions are going to be an important place to start. The more negotiation we can get done before Busan, the better. So we really are going to have to track that very closely, between now and November, if we're going to see to get it done. And Mike, while I've got you here on the air, you going to fly me to Busan or what? Are we going to do this next one on the ground, live and in person?
We'll do it live. We'll do it live. Sure.
Okay. We'll talk about that. But on that note, I want to thank you all for coming here. I appreciate it. This is important. I have been beating the drum here on this type of issue. You can join us at some of our other upcoming webinars. We have a good vehicle to grid webinar coming up as well. And next week is our forum in Boston. So if you're in the Northeast, we encourage you to join us there. But with that, I want to say thank you, and we can open it up for questions.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think there's a couple of questions related to this, but that's been on my mind also is the nature of this intersessional work, and maybe in particular how industry is going to be or could be involved with that, right? Do you have a sense of how that works? Do they designate a committee? Can you join the committee and if there's any sense of what some of the key questions that intersectional work is going to be addressing between now and our trip to Busan?
Yeah. So they designate committees, right? And they give those committees specific tasks. I think it's actually more challenging for the industry to be part of that. The intersessional work tends to be done more by the members of the UN delegations themselves, right?
Yeah.
Another element of the intersessional work is the work that is done by the UN group itself, right? The organizing committee.
UN staff, yeah.
The staff of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee. So they're the ones who collect all the comments from all the countries and collate them into these draft versions of the actual document themselves. So that's part of what happens as well, is that all these things, everything that gets talked about kind of has to get processed, right? So we didn't get, all the statements that were made, the country level comments that were made during INC3, they didn't get fully they were all published and available, but they didn't get integrated into the draft and cleaned up until, sometime ahead of INC4. So there is a lot of work that happens both on an official and then also subcommittee level. But in general, I think it's a little harder for the corporates to get involved there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's this question in all these negotiations of the role that restrictions on primary production or regulations around product packaging design versus investments in recycling infrastructure will play in this attempt to address plastic waste, right? And it's a lot of ways that's kind of the big debate, right? Do we need to get rid of plastic or do we just need to recycle it better? But so there's an interesting question about what does this mean then for other types of packaging, right? Is this making you bullish on aluminum bottles as a replacement for plastic bottles, or for paper packaging? Something we've also talked a lot about,
Yeah,
here
for
at Lux
sure.
with our clients and things.
For sure. I mean, one of the things that is emerging as more likely from INC4 as opposed to INC3 is guidelines and restrictions on shape and design of plastic packaging, right? So you're going to see potentially the elimination of certain problematic form factors. Some of the stuff I think we can just eliminate. It's just not necessary. Things like straws, right? We can use metal straws. That's good for metal, but we can also
Or
just
like
not use straw at all,
plastic
right?
disposable forks, that sort of thing, right? But would that
Exactly.
also include, like getting rid of, thin films or stand-up pouches? Like some of
Yeah,
those
and
types of form
that
factors are
is
much
the
harder
kind
to
of thing.
recycle. That's the
That
kind of
stuff
thing
is
there.
certainly in scope, and it remains to be seen exactly. And this is one of the things that we're going to get. One of the intersectional work from INC4 is more definitions on what is problematic, right? And beginning to really hammer out and narrow that stuff down. But I do think it will be good for metal packaging in particular. Um, barrier,
Yeah.
barrier functionality is one of the things that often requires unrecyclable plastic products, right? And something that's metal is a lot easier to achieve that in a recyclable form factor. So there's a real opportunity there. Paper packaging remains kind of up in the air to me. I think in general this will benefit paper packaging, but it remains to be seen. And it remains to be seen how much switching this actually causes, and that's part of the restriction. So metals, I think aluminum in particular, is pretty likely to benefit. And then there's a wide range of potential outcomes and impacts depending on some of these definitions and how these rules get written.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess the other, sort of a question around recycling infrastructure also, and that was something that, like I was reading Dow Chemical's statement that they put out about this, and there's a lot of emphasis in that on investments in the recycling infrastructure, and that need, and waste management infrastructure, collecting, sortation, and
Mm-hmm.
obviously the actual recycling facilities. Um, is there a sense of what the financing or support mechanisms for that are going to be coming out of this? Is it really going to be heavily EPR driven, or what's going to drive the investments in
Yeah,
infrastructure, and how successful is that going to be?
there's two things I would kind of you know pull out here. One is that there is the existing recycling infrastructure in relatively like
Right.
mature and developed countries, right? And there, I think you're going to see the global and more broad introduction of extended producer responsibility as and polluter pays type of principles as a way to basically finance and manage the cost of plastic products and plastic packaging, right? um, so that's a pretty big change for some place like America, right, where it's very fragmented, very local municipal level even. We don't really have any type of significant national level regulation or management of our waste management ecosystem at all, right? There's some EPA regulations, mostly on stuff like what can your landfill like, what does your landfill design have to be like, right? But we don't have a national level recycling system in America. So that's one element. The other big element, and this is a lot less clear, the corporate world is very focused on recycling. But a lot of the document is about existing plastic pollution. And again, this reflects
Mhm.
the actors who are at play here. We're talking about island nations, right? Their concerns are very much around plastics in the ocean, illegal dumping of plastics, open burning and mistreatment of plastics, river cleanup, that type of thing. So there's a whole set of financing for those types of activities, which are, I'm going to call non-economic, right? They're not really things that you can make money off of, or very, very difficult, they're very limited to make money off of. That's where we
Yeah.
need some funding mechanisms. We have a lot of proposals from the nations, but we really don't have a lot of clarity there. So that's one of the things we need to.
Another resonance, perhaps,
Another thing to
with the
figure out.
UN climate.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
and you can say even in the climate, it's very contentious, right? So the
Sure.
idea that
Yeah,
we can
it's
get
one.
to a resolution on that in the next 6 months is pretty challenging.
Yeah. Sure. All right. Well, we'll of course be continuing to follow this, and bringing you our next update after, and perhaps from Busan. But thanks to everyone for joining us for the webinar today. We will send out the presentation and the recording, so you'll receive that in your inboxes sometime soon. After you leave, you will get prompted to complete a survey. Please do fill that in. We really look closely at that feedback and use that to improve our webinars. You can even put in there if you think Anthony should go to Busan. Put in a vote for that. And as Anthony mentioned, check out the upcoming webinars and other events from Lux. But thanks again to everybody for joining. Thanks, Anthony, for the presentation and discussion, and have a great rest of your day.